Hello y'all, hope you're all doing well. This is RJ here at Point Lookout Prisoner of War Camp. There's so much to say about this. This is a very special place. This right here is the Confederate Memorial Park. The actual Point Lookout Confederate Cemetery is just over here, and I'll walk here in just a moment. But this is a very special place. It was right here that was the America's largest POW camp of them all. It was right here. There was 52,000 Southern Americans who fought the Confederacy that were held as prisoners right here in this god-awful, god-forsaken landscape. Poor sanitary conditions, living in tents, no shelters, contaminated water, sewage, poor, terrible diet, terrible food, out there in the elements in the winter, in the summer, death and disease all over. It is right over here that I'll walk over here real soon, where there is the Confederate cemetery, where they said there is between roughly about 3,400 Confederates buried there, all the way up to more likely 6,000 or 7,000. It's quite extraordinary. So first I'm going to walk through this Confederate Memorial Park, and then I'll continue on to the Confederate Cemetery. They've done a wonderful job here. Those folks, I really just had a great discussion with them, great talk with them again. I've come here several times over the years. And I encourage you to get involved and help support this memorial park right here. This originally started out with just a couple acres, and just a couple years ago they bought the land that's just over here. So I think it's right now closer to 6 or 7 acres of land. There's a memorial over here I'm going to walk to here in just a moment. That was the memorial that used to be in Silver Springs, Maryland, that was removed from a graveyard actually. And over here in the background is a mound. That mound is where, I'll talk about that real soon, the remnants of many other Confederates that were dug up when they were expanding a road. But as you walk in here, you see atop here the Confederate flag atop this pole, also known as the Naval Jack. It's known as the rebel flag. You see the States of the Confederacy represented here on all sides. See the statue right here? I'm just going to do a real quick pass coming through here. But as it says, dedicated to the memory of Confederate POWs, military and civilian men, women, and children who were incarcerated in Point Lookout Prison Camp, 1863 to 1865. Erected by the Point Lookout POW Descendants Organization, 2008. If you're ever over here, this is just about a mile south of Point Lookout State Park. Point Lookout State Park is just down this road, about a mile down this road. That is where the confluence of the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River meet. There's a famous lighthouse down this road. You can see some of the representation of the walls here that were just built not too long ago. I'm not going to read all this right now, but you can see, to the memories of our past, who are patient and who wait, true and faithful to the last, for the eastern morning sky, when wrong's rock shall roll away, and the spectre of right, and the right shall rise again, in the brightness of a light that shall never fade away. See the bricks down here below as well. See a little plaque here on the side. Confederate Memorial Park in court. Incorporated, dedicated September 6th, 2008. And you see those here, Jim Dunbar, Joseph Dunbar, Frank Tauberman, Fran Tauberman, Stephen. Thank you to all those people who are involved in this really special hallowed grounds, this special place here, this Confederate Memorial Park, where they are trying to have those beautiful memorials and monuments that used to be over there in Baltimore, those 3 monuments that are now over in Chicago right now, on display over there. They are trying to bring those here, trying to also bring the one that was in Montgomery County. I hope they can do that before long. You see a map of this place, or actually this location is would be north of this particular map. And I'll talk more about that here soon. So as I walk over here, I'm gonna go over to the memorial that was placed here about maybe 2 years ago or so. It used to be over in Silver Springs. But as I walk over that direction, I want to point off in the distance, there's a mound. And basically what happened here was there were 3 or 4 different Confederate cemeteries in this area. And in 1870, there was those Confederate cemeteries, and all the soldiers, all they had were wooden headstones, and a fire came through and burned and destroyed all those headstones, and the cattle trampled them and everything else. And all the names and all the locations, all those are buried there, were lost. Except for, they believe, many were recorded when they were interned there to begin with. That's why there are names over here of 3,000, I think it was 368, that are listed around the 85-foot tall obelisk over here. But there are far more than that. But when they were widening the road, they widened the road, and that went right through a cemetery. And they took the remains and they put them on dump trucks and they put them in a fill. And when locals found out, they were outraged because it included the remains of those Confederate soldiers. And what they did is they brought the remains over and put them in that pile across the field here. So that pile is the remains of many Confederate soldiers. You go around the side here and you see the voices from the pen, those sad stories of those who were imprisoned here, their letters, many that died. Said as many as, best estimates are around 6,000 that were buried here. I'm gonna walk over the Confederate Cemetery soon, but before I do so, I'm coming up to the memorial that was placed here about 2 years ago. This used to be on the graveyard grounds in Silver Springs, Maryland, just on the north side of Washington, D.C. And these are the soldiers that were with General Ewell Early. They were with General Ewell Early when he went and pressured Washington, D.C. to take some of the pressure off the Petersburg campaign. And as you know, after the Battle of Monocacy, he continued on and got to the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and he was able to attack the outer fortifications of Washington, D.C. And while he was there, there was at least 17 Southerners who fought the Confederacy that were killed, and they were buried in the graveyard there in that Episcopal church. Well, I had been there for all those years until the so-called Summer of Love, 2020, which, well, of course, is Summer of Hate, when the Marxists came through and they toppled this memorial right here that used to be in Silver Springs. I saw it before it was removed. I went to go see this a couple times before it was removed. And because the church is now woke, the so-called quote-unquote church, it's really more of an indoctrination camp, they refused to replace it. But thankfully it was brought here. And you can read what it says. It says, "To the memory of the 17 unknown Confederate dead, who fell in front of Washington, D.C. on January 12th, 1864. And you can read more about that right here. It used to be there in Grace Church Cemetery, Confederate Monument. In fact, it speaks about it right here. This monument was originally at the Grace Church Cemetery at the corner of Grace Church Road and Georgia Avenue in Silver Springs, Maryland. It was rededicated at Confederate Memorial Park on October 9th, 2020. Until its relocation to Confederate Memorial Park, the monument marked the final resting place of 17 Confederate soldiers who fell during General Ewell Early's July 1864 attack on Fort Stevens, Washington, D.C., about 3 miles south of the Grace Church Cemetery. The 17 soldiers were initially buried where they fell on the Osborne farm. 10 years later, after they fell, Reverend James Everett, the pastor of Grace Church and a Confederate veteran, led an effort to disinter and rebury them in front of the church in 1874. The 17 bodies in 6 plain coffins were reburied in a cemetery attended by about 300 people. You can read about that. I'm not going to read all of it right now, but you can see what it says. Now I'm going to continue on to the Confederate Park. Got some visitors. While I've been here a few hours, and there have been quite a few people come to visit. Once again, this is out of the way. This is just south of St. Mary's, which was the very first capital of Maryland. And this is just about about a 1 mile trip north of Point Lookout, right on the very edge. This is one of the 5 fingers of Maryland. And this was all part of a POW camp during the war. In fact, this was not just the largest POW camp for the Union, but the largest POW camp, period. Because Andersonville had a size of around 45 or so total over the period of years. Well, this one had a total of about 52,000 Southern Americans that were interned here over a period of time. It was originally designed for only about 10,000 folks, but it swelled to over twice that number. And over a period of about 54,000 came through here. And we all know about Andersonville, but this place in many ways was far worse than Andersonville, because although the South was already devastated and starving and they could barely feed themselves, the Union had plenty. The difference was the Union refused to pay these to take care of the soldiers they had. And the POW exchange ended because of the North. They're the ones who ended the POW exchange. They wanted to force the South to use their manpower to take care of prisoners that they never wanted. And they say it was brutal, terrible, awful environment here. Where Southern Americans came here, they all got all kinds of diseases, typhoid, smallpox. Water was terrible, sewage was terrible. They had next to no clothing, terrible food. They were out in the elements, there was no hard structures for them at all. So it was just a terrible, awful Point Lookout lookout. They said the water was an awful situation. You can read about it right here, Point Lookout Prison. This memorial plaza is to honor the sacrifice of 52,264 Confederate soldiers, sailors, and civilians imprisoned here during the war between the states. Point Lookout Prison Camp was established immediately following the Battle of Gettysburg and was operated by the Union Army from September 1863 to June 1865. You can read more about that. But they say the Confederate soldiers that came through here, many were transferred to Elmira up there in New York. And they said those Confederate soldiers look like skeletons. We've all heard about what the Union prisoner POWs look like coming out of Andersonville. Well, they look just as bad here. and it is very sketchy. When General Wirtz was being held on trial, and he's been known as the only man convicted of a war crime, who was the commandant of Andersonville, they said there was a famous photographer here. They took a lot of photos of this place, and they said it was terrible. The Confederate soldiers who were POWs here, they were starved, they were beaten, they were brutalized. And all those photos came up missing. It was said the photographer who came here, he said all of his stuff was so-called quote-unquote stolen. He said, oh, some youth came in to his house and broke all of his tintypes and all of his photos that he took. So they don't have any photos of this place because of the claim that, oh, they were stolen. They didn't want, it's almost as though Union was very proud to not have any proof of just how atrocious this place was. Here you see this, so here it is, the newest memorial. This is the first thing I noticed. This was not here when I had last visited a little over a year ago. Maryland, my Maryland. I'm not gonna read all this, but this was dedicated just really recently in 2025. So isn't this cool? The newest monument. So thank you to those who provided this. I'm just gonna read this in part. The newest memorial just dedicated here this year. It says, Maryland remembers with honor and valor the devotion of more than 22,000 sons who served in the Confederate States of America's Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. They served in the Maryland line as well as other units across the Confederacy. And it continues on here. Also remembered is the sacrifice of countless civilian men, women, and children who supported the war effort by acting as guides, couriers, medical personnel, and blockade runners. And you can read on here. Really nice new memorial. I'm passing by this. I'm just sharing with you kind of the tip of the iceberg of this memorial park. Now I'm going to make a trip over to the actual Confederate cemetery, which is under jurisdiction of the War Veterans of War Department. And thankfully, it's really nice. It's right on the edge here, just a short walking distance. It's also worth mentioning the conditions were particularly terrible here because I'm only about 3 or 4 feet above sea level. This whole area is only about 3 or 4 feet above sea level. And so they said there's lots of stories of soldiers always having to stand in water. You can see right here, not all this water here. The moment you dig down just a little bit, you're already hitting water. Here at this Confederate Memorial Park. And so the poor water, the contaminated water, all this water nonstop, it was a terrible place to have a POW camp. That's why it was such a high rate. Now I'm walking down nearby. Those who own this camp are trying to achieve this property right here. They're trying to acquire this property. I encourage you to get involved, help them out. Definitely going to cost some money. I'm glad they acquired that land that's over here. So now land that was originally about 3 acres, now they own about 7 acres. That's awesome, awesome news. But how much better would it be to be able to acquire this land right here too? And to be able to put something like a battle flag on the edge. And thankfully the property owner has allowed a battle flag to be placed around the edge there. But here it is, hallowed grounds. You can see here, once again, there was originally about 3 or 4 different Confederate cemeteries that were here in Point Lookout. And they originally only had wooden headstones or head markers for each of those. And like I said, a fire came through, cattle came through, the elements, and all of them were lost. And so in 1870, Well, partly due to that, and also the erosion, because this is right on the edge of Chesapeake Bay. Chesapeake Bay is just on there over here, just beyond, actually beyond this tree line up back here. And the Potomac River is just over this direction. So just on the outskirts there, the water line started eroding and started exposing the graves. And so in 1870, they started moving the remains of those Confederate soldiers to right here. And they put them in this mound right underneath this 85-foot tall obelisk that was created by the United States government. And that's where these names are right here. But then later on, as they started doing more excavating, they started to create more roads and other things, and they found more remains other places. And then about around 1930s, then they placed the remainder of those remains. They dug a big, massive hole right here in the back, and they started placing the others that they found in the backside along here. But originally, so this is basically a mass grave. These soldiers here that were buried in all these Confederate cemeteries, basically they hired two black men to get to, and they were paid by the body, and they placed the remains of 10 Confederate soldiers in a box, per box. It was the remains of 10 Confederate soldiers, and they called this a vault. And so they opened up the earth right here, and they had these boxes, and they placed the remains of 10 Confederate soldiers per box. And they just filled this area in till there was equivalent of well over 3,000 remains here in a mound right here. And then later on they added those. And they have the names here, but those names, that's why there are so many names that were not captured in all those other cemeteries. So although it says there's 3,468, as I remember, that were buried here, it's really closer to probably 6,000. Some say, I mean, the highest estimate, some say 14,000 could be buried right through here. But I'll read this to you in part. This obelisk right here, 85 feet tall, was placed here in 1910. Once again, if I get my dates wrong, I apologize. I'm just doing this off the cuff. I don't have any cliff notes or anything with me. But you can see right here, I'll just read this top piece. Erected by the United States to mark the burial place of Confederate and soldiers and sailors who died at Point Lookout, Maryland, while prisoners of war, and were there buried in the number of 3,384. But whose remains were subsequently removed either to the respective homes or to the cemetery where the individual graves cannot now be identified. So they cannot identify any of these. This is like so many other POW camps, Union POW camps of Confederate soldiers. Pretty much next to none of them have individual marked graves. They're all mostly unmarked graves. But thankfully, they do have the names of those here. So talking to the good folks who run the Confederate Memorial Park that's just over here, beyond these trees, they say people often do come here to look for names of their ancestors or relatives. And unfortunately, there are many more names that will be forever lost, known only to God. So you see the names on all sides, on all four sides here, and also up here as well. Just walking around the outskirts. So once again, that's why I say I think this is the largest mass grave, where they say there's at least 3,000, about 3,400 that are buried in this mass grave. They put that in perspective. Now there are cemeteries like Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg, where there's 30,000 Southern Americans who fought with the Confederacy there that are buried there, and just about 90% are unknown. But they are buried over a larger area, so it's not in one single mass grave. but most are unknown, and almost all are unmarked graves in places like Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg. And there's places like Fredericksburg, and I shared a live video from there not too long ago, where Fredericksburg, under the central mound, where's the memorial, there's about 2,000 buried in a mass grave there in Fredericksburg Confederate Cemetery. And the lucky ones, less than half of them, have individual markers and have marked graves, about 1,500. So there's about 3,500 total buried in Fredericksburg Cemetery, for example. But for the most part, the vast majority are unknown. That's why these memorials are so important. Now, it's worth mentioning, when they reinterred him here, this was just a large mound for a couple decades. And before this was placed here, this 85-foot tall obelisk, this one was placed here in 1910, like I mentioned. Before this memorial over here was actually the first memorial that was placed here. This dates back to 1876. Basically, sesquicentennial, 1876, mainly dedicated to Maryland. And I'll walk over here in a moment. This memorial right here has been moved about 3 times. So originally, it was placed here in 1876, right? So, I was a little bit off in the dates, but so for a while, when all those over 3,000 soldiers were reinterred here, and the remains were placed in boxes, and they covered it over, and there was a mound. For that first roughly 6 years, it was just a mound. But in 1876, they placed this memorial right here, there. And this was erected by the state of Maryland in memory of the Confederate soldiers who died prisoners of war at Point Lookout from March 1st, 1864 to June 30th, 1865. You can read more about the commissioners here. Colonel William Elliott, General William Oates, Governor James Berry, William C. Oates, premature, talking about Oates, who was the part of the Alabama 15th, who took the Alabama 15th up Little Round Top after he just finished a 20-mile march, and he was asked on that hot day in July in Gettysburg, it was him who took his troops up there to Little Round Top, and he later, after the war, became kind of a leader in the memorial and ensuring that there's as many more proper memorials as possible. You can see here, representing those, they did the best they could for this monument this memorial dates back to 1876. You see those buried from different states, for example, Virginia, 640, North Carolina, 962, South Carolina, 248, Georgia, 249, and it continues on. I hope you can read that. Confederate states not designated, 618, total 3,000, this one's saying 3,004. Of course, those are the best estimates they had at the time. Here's the comment, the quote, the engraving on the side of this memorial, dating back to 1876, right? About 150 years. It says, as it says here, at the call of patriotism and duty, they encountered the perils of the field, endured the trials of a prison, and were faithful even unto death. Once again erected. So once again, this memorial right here was the very first memorial that was placed here at Point Lookout. It was here for over 30 years until eventually it was replaced by this memorial right here. And then this memorial was moved about a quarter mile, half mile down the road. So this Maryland monument was moved down the road, and then later it was brought back here. One thing I love about this, I'm not not sure why a guy wants to pull up in his freaking loud truck and just sit here. But anyway, so one thing I do love about this is this flag right here. I really appreciate the Sons of Confederate Veterans and others who placed this memorial flag. The Army of Northern Virginia Confederate battle flag right here on the outskirts. Very cool. Right here on the edge of Point Lookout Confederate Cemetery, which is the largest, I believe, the largest mass grave Confederate soldiers in the world. This is the land right here that the Confederate Memorial Society that owns and maintains this beautiful Confederate Memorial Park over here. I'll walk over there again in just a moment. This is the land they're trying to acquire. Of course, it's gonna cost some money. They'll probably put it on the market, but I encourage you to help support them. Can you imagine how cool that would be to have more, this whole area developed as well as Confederate Memorial Park continues over here? And it's promising because the owner of this land did allow them to place this flag here. So once again, for those of you who just joined me, I'm at Point Lookout Confederate Cemetery. This is just about a mile north of Point Lookout State Park here in Maryland. This is on the far end of this particular point, one of the five fingers of Maryland, right where the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac rivers meet. This is only about 3 or 4 feet above sea level, which is why the death rate was so high, because the water table was so high. Or so low, I guess, depends how you look at that. Just want to share some of this with you, a different perspective of this. Once again, this was the largest POW camp of them all, where 52,000 Confederate soldiers were imprisoned here, which made it larger than Andersonville. It was just as deadly and just as brutal as Andersonville. It used to be called Camp Hoffman, and you can read about that here as well. The Union prison at Camp Hoffman, Maryland, called Point Lookout, opened in 1863. A 15-foot high plank fence surrounded the 40-acre prison compound. And that's what they have recreated in the little tiny part. They're not going to recreate all 40 acres, of course, but at least a section of it, kind of very similar to Andersonville. It says the first prisoners arrived in July 1863. Confederates captured at the Battle of Gettysburg. By the end of the year, the population reached 9,000. All prisoners lived in tents, including the sick. When the war ended in April 1865, the prison housed 22,000 men. Between 1863 and 1865, when it closed, more than 52,000 prisoners had been held at Point Lookout. More than 3,000 died and were interred in 3 prison cemeteries. Once again, really saying 3 to 4. There's another one. There's a lot of different cemeteries around this area. After the war, some bodies were removed from the cemeteries at Point Lookout. However, no record was made who was removed. That's why these names here are pretty sketchy. Not really clear. One unauthorized business removed bodies at the request of a friend or family for a fee. In 1867, the War Department purchased the land containing the Union and Confederate cemeteries. Soon the U.S. Army moved Union remains to Arlington National Cemetery. Confederate remains at Point Lookout were marked with new headboards. 3 years later, the state of Maryland purchased this ground and moved 3,400 Confederate dead from the federal owned cemeteries to this site. In 1876, Maryland erected a modest obelisk, and that's what we just looked at right here. And one of the things that also inflates the number is the state says that all those people were here to maintain that huge hospital that was here. It was one of the largest hospitals in the world that was here. And this is also a Union, an outpost as well, and a docking station. There was there was far more Union soldiers that died than were actually removed. So they suspect that many of those who were buried here were in this Confederate cemetery were also Union as well, which inflates the number even more. This speaks right here about this obelisk right here, this 85-foot granite obelisk. It says, the Commission for Marking Graves of Confederate Dead began documenting interments at Point Lookout in 1906. So this is a long time after the war. After the commissioner determined that the graves could not be marked individually, he received permission to erect a single monument, right? So they determined they could not, or they refused to mark them individually. Maryland deeded this cemetery to the federal government in 1910. A granite company in Boston, Massachusetts finished the 85-foot granite obelisk the following year. Bronze plaques on the monument base and the mound supporting it contained the names of 3,384 Confederate soldiers and sailors. 44 civilians identified the commission as buried at the site are not listed. However, the exact number of individuals who died at the prison and are buried here may never be determined. It mentioned, which is also interesting, because this also represents, it wasn't just Confederate soldiers that were buried here, it was civilians. Because remember, Lincoln had suspended habeas corpus. He was willing to arrest you on the drop of a dime. The Union soldiers were ready to arrest anyone who was even a Southern sympathizer. That's why they say Lincoln forced, for example, all the churches to have U.S. flags, federal flags in their church service, and forced them to pray for Lincoln in the church. And under the threat that if they did not pray for the president, then they would potentially be thrown out, and potentially their church could potentially be destroyed. Can you imagine that happening today? The U.S. government comes in and tells you who to pray for and what flags to have and what to think, and you couldn't share any opinions. Can you imagine the people that would be thrown in prison right now for how they talk about our current president? Can they understand why those who understand the South and are pro-Southern don't have any love for President Lincoln? Do they understand that? Can you imagine having a president that was willing to arrest you, willing to bust in your house and throw you in some prison somewhere just because of how you thought, and the most slightest sharing opinions that didn't match with their beliefs? It's happened before. So I'm going to continue on now. Once again, this is under the Veterans Administration here at Point Lookout. I'm going to continue on and finish this video where I started, over the Confederate Memorial Park here at Point Lookout. This is a bit out of the way, not entirely easy to get to, but you got to come here and stop by and see it sometime. Of course, not just the Confederate cemetery right here, not just this, but also the Confederate Park that's over here as well. So I'm gonna walk over here back to Confederate Memorial Park. So once again, reminds me a little bit of Valor Park. I just shared a photo of that yesterday. Valor Park was created there closer to Denton, or closer to Lexington, North Carolina. And originally it was created because the Confederate memorial that was in Lexington, North Carolina, was forcibly removed against the will of the people. It was removed there, and so they created a park for it. Well, then it became kind of a grounds for other memorials as well. So there was the Confederate Memorial that was over in Pittsboro, North Carolina. They needed to find a place for it, so they moved it also to Valor Park. And then later on, they moved the Confederate Memorial to Winston-Salem. And there's going to be more. So there is actually right now 3 large, beautiful Confederate memorials over in Valor Park. And there's no other Confederate park quite like it. It's a non-profit type place. Well, this is kind of almost the equivalent for Maryland. And so there is an attempt, I'm hoping, there is an attempt to try to relocate. There's 3 beautiful memorials and monuments that used to be in Baltimore that were removed, right? One of them was to the women. There was another one that looked just like the one that was in Salisbury. Was that depiction of the angel carrying a dying Confederate soldier up to heaven. And I think a Solar Sailor memorial as well. They're over on display right now as a point of they're trying to ridicule and mock Confederate soldiers over there in Chicago. Well, they're trying to bring them here. There could be a place of honor. So thank you. Thank you to the good folks here who help maintain this. They come out here, they help preserve it. They got this started. That's what it takes. It just takes people who care. Right, what a beautiful scene this is right here. I was just asking about the what happened to this historical marker right here. This historical marker has a fascinating history. This historical marker right here said it came up missing. It was displayed for quite a while, and it was missing for like close to 10 years. Somebody just stole it, and they're looking to replace it. Well, somebody ran across it at like a flea market. Somebody was trying to sell it, and they knew it was stolen property. And they got the sheriffs involved. The people who had it were trying to sell it for a couple $1,000s, and they ended up acquiring it. For a while there, it was placed in somebody's garage, and then finally, thankfully, they bring it back here. And finally, the other one was finally replaced. It was the State of Roads Commission of Maryland that helped place this here with the help of the St. Mary's County Historical Society. But keep track of your historical markers, because the Mayo Marxist, leftist out there, they're looking not only to remove and destroy and erase history, literally erase it, even attacking historical markers. I mean, how low can you get? But also trying to make a buck off this stuff. So once again, just leaving this with you today at Point Lookout, prisoner of war camp. It's a beautiful scene. I'll have to come back here a bit later on sometime. Prefer to come out here where when the sun's out and maybe at the right angle. But I have really enjoyed, once again, chatting with the good folks here who help found this, who help maintain it, help preserve it, and look out for it. And you can see right here in front of me, there is this video camera. They said this place has more video cameras than Fort Knox. Got video cameras all over the place. The sheriff comes by here and checks on it frequently. Thankfully, they haven't really had many issues. Of course, the leftists try to push things once in a while, but there are video cameras from every angle around here, picking up my voice right now. So that's very encouraging. That's what people need to do. Unfortunately, it's a sad time when even memorial parks for prisoners of war are being attacked. Unbelievable. So leaving this with you today, just once again, a roundabout of Point Lookout, just a live version today. Glad to be able to share this with you. I I encourage you to come out here if you're ever around. You can see the sign off in the distance. It says Point Lookout State Park, just about a mile up the road. This Confederate Park. One last look at this beautiful location before I close up for now. Glad to be able to share this with you today. Thanks for everybody out there who are just helping out to keep American history alive, paying respects, honoring, going out there, helping maintain places like this, donating, volunteering, supporting. That's why, even though I don't have much money, I don't make money off this, but I do it gives me comfort knowing that a little bit of extra money goes off to helping parks like this. And also helping preservation efforts too. That's why I'm a member of also the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation. I'm also a member of the American Battlefield Trust. I help contribute to these parks like this. I'm a member of the SEV. I've been a member of the SEV for a number of years. We may not agree on everything, but hey, a lot of good like-minded folks who think alike, and I really appreciate their efforts. My SEV camp helps go out to different Confederate cemeteries. We go help maintain them. We put wreaths out, so we help flag sites. We get involved with memorials. We have ceremonies, and it's been just wonderful involved with people like that. So once again, leaving this with you today. Hope you're all doing well. From here at Point Lookout Prisoner of War Camp in these hallowed grounds. They said they are going to try to release a book at some point about this. So much more information. We know the basics about this particular place, but there is so much more fascinating information. So take care, y'all. Glad to be able to share this with you today. May God bless you. May God bless and save America. May God bless and save Dixie.